Hello again, and welcome to the second edition of Real Sensical Politics. I'm John,
My name is Matthew.
and welcome back. Today we're going to discuss a number of things Alberta related. First off is the new Alberta panel, and we're going to bookend that with some history of conservatism in Alberta. It's a long and interesting history, at times sordid, at times acrimonious, but always interesting. Weave that into the Firewall Letter of 2001, which is very much informing policy to this day. Talk about separation a little bit and the recent return of the MAC, or rather return of the Progressive Conservatives in Alberta, the party that governed Alberta from 1971 through 2015. And then it was the United Conservatives under Jason Kenney that have governed Alberta since 2019, and now it's, of course, Premier Danielle Smith. So, I will talk a little bit about the history of conservatism in Alberta. So, Alberta was founded as a province in 1905. Amazingly, for the first 16 years, it was a Liberal government until 1921, although it was a very, very different government than the kind of social liberals that dominate the Liberal Party today. This was a very socially conservative agrarian Liberal Party. They lost power in 1921 to a now defunct party called the United Farmers of Alberta, and they lost power in turn in 1935 in the middle of the Great Depression to a religiously, socially conservative, fiscally conservative, mostly rural, but they did have some significant support in the cities, party called Social Credit, who governed Alberta from 1935 through 1971, when Peter Lougheed and the Progressive Conservatives supplanted them and became the dominant actor in Alberta provincial politics for the next 40 or so years, until Premier Jim Prentice in 2015 was defeated by the New Democratic Party, NDP, under Rachel Notley. And then, so at the time in 2015, there was a Progressive Conservative Party and another Conservative Party, the Wild Rose Party. And they were splitting the vote, and the various folks in that camps of the Wild Rose Party and Progressive Conservative Party got together, and they formed what is now the United Conservative Party, UCP, who came back to power in 2019 under former Premier Jason Kenney, and the party was re-elected in 2023. I was thinking 2022 or 2023. I'm not great with dates. I'm pretty close, but I'm not bang on. 2023 under the current Premier, Danielle Smith. So that's a very, very, very long overview. One important thing I think that's important to mention, though, in the growth of Alberta conservative politics, or conservatives, or policy in general, is Albertans hold their natural resources, in particular oil and gas, very zealously. That's a big driver of the economy in Alberta, and gives the government a lot of money. Not as much now as it has in the past. In the 1970s, non-renewable resource revenue accounted for 70% of the total GDP, and now it's about, I think, 15 or something. So it's pretty significant, but less significant than it was. Interestingly, in my research for this particular topic, I learned that in 1905, Alberta did not have rights to its mineral rights or any natural resources, and it was a long forgotten premier by the name of Brownlee. There's a building named after him in downtown Edmonton in 1930 that negotiated successfully with Mackenzie King, I believe, might have been R.B. Bennett, to get Alberta their rights to their oil. So that was one of the biggest coups, maybe. I don't know if that's the right word, but that was definitely very influential. And the repercussions of that carry on to this very day.
Well, I think one of the other interesting, and again, this is my practical take on the political situation why is Alberta so conservative? So when you look at the immigration levels to Alberta throughout its history, we've had traditionally a larger Ukrainian immigration here from Europe, and that was during the World Wars, particularly World War II and the rise of communism in the Soviet Union. And so people who were not uh, leaning that way naturally left, and a lot of them settled here in Alberta and in rural Alberta nonetheless. And a lot of them are farmers. We have the great communities of Vegreville and Mundare as examples here in the province of Alberta, and they are very Ukrainian culturally, and we love them. Happy to have them here. I love Mundare sausage myself, one of my favorite things, and so that added to it. But then also you had a large immigration from the United States south, and a lot of that was actually even LDS, or as people call them, Mormon settlers. They were a large part of the settlement in southern Alberta, and naturally they're very conservative themselves. And you also had Hutterites and Mennonites and a lot of these other cultures that are naturally conservatives with their views, both socially and fiscally, and they settled southern Alberta. And when you look at how conservative policy and politics has morphed in the province, it has always come from southern Alberta. So the United Farmers of Alberta morphed in southern Alberta and moved up. Social Credit, again, same thing. Southern Alberta morphed, moved up. The PC Party, undoubtedly, same thing. And then it was really interesting in more modern times that we were really looking at this, and most of our listeners would probably recognize the emergence of the wild rose, again, southern Alberta, and then it moved its way up. What's interesting, though, with the wild rose is that they did not form government as a party. They did form official opposition once, and so that was kind of a break with tradition where the morphing of conservatism didn't actually accentuate into a party itself, or a governing party itself.
Interestingly enough, that when they became official opposition, it was our current Premier, Danielle Smith, wearing a different hat. She lost that election to Alison Redford.
Yeah.
And then made the fateful decision to cross the floor, and the rest is history.
And, funny story for our listeners, and to give you some background and context of where I come from. At the time of the 2012 election, when that happened, I was a youth executive for the Progressive Conservative Association of Alberta, and a rotating member as such on the executive board of the PC Party itself. And I was there during the first meeting after the election, and I remember everybody around the board table was patting themselves on the back, and they were all really happy that they won the election and congratulating each other. And I remember Premier Redford walked in, and I made that very unfortunate, fateful decision to maybe try to correct the conversation a little bit and say, guys, we did not win this election. The Wild Rose lost it. And if we don't change tactics and focus, we are not going to win the next election.
Lake of Fire.
Yeah, the Lake of Fire, and that could be a topic for another day. But that
they were ahead going into that weekend.
Yeah, the Wild Rose was about to win the election, and then Danielle Smith refused to remove a Lake of Fire candidate, and public opinion just completely collapsed for the Wild Rose. And I remember Alison Redford heard that comment around the table, and she looked at me, and I swear if looks could kill, I would have burned to a crisp in my chair. I sat uncomfortably for a few minutes for the rest of that meeting.
You're not wrong.
No. I mean, history proved me right, but it just was one of those learning experiences for me, political observations that you have to have the right timing on. And so that's a little bit about where I come from. But the reason I mentioned this distinction with the Wild Rose not forming government is because it was the merging of the PCs and the Wild Rose after the NDP won government that re-elected Conservatives in Alberta under the United Conservative Party. And I always found that to be interesting, that you had, the UFA emerged, formed government, Social Credit emerged, formed government. PCs emerged, formed government. Wild Rose emerged, and then basically collapsed when they crossed the floor to the PCs under Prentice. And then you had the two parties officially merged together. And now we have, of course, the return of the PC party, a couple of MLAs that are currently sitting in the legislature, Scott St. Clair and Peter Guthrie, I should say the Honorable Peter Guthrie, former minister here in Alberta. They were removed from the UCP caucus earlier in the legislative term, I believe last year. And they have decided to try to rebuild the PC party back. And what's going to be interesting here, John, and I'll get your take on this. While they do that, they're going to have a bit of a time because the PC party as a name is currently reserved. The UCP party has it reserved, but they haven't actually done anything with it yet. So my understanding with Elections Alberta is that even though the PC party, the United Conservative Party has it reserved, Peter Guthrie and Scott St. Clair can get the petition going and re-emerge it and take the name back as their own. And I think that'll be a very interesting dynamic. I personally, as a conservative, am a little frightened of this because the natural thing, of course, is, well, the last time we split the conservative vote, the NDP won. Is this really what we want to do? Is there enough of an appetite to actually gain a majority under the PC name as opposed to, fighting between the PC and the UCP? I think it'll be interesting to watch.
Well, it will be. And also looking back into political history on the federal level, we had something very similar that you and I are both old enough to remember during the late 1980s and into the 90s, all of the 90s, and a good chunk of the 2000s, a good 15 years there, where there were two competing right/center-right parties in the Progressive Conservative Party of Canada and the Reform Party that were competing and fishing in that same pool. And that resulted in liberal election after liberal election. And I remember thinking as a kid in the late 1990s, just thinking, these guys are going to be in power forever. And that obviously didn't happen. And under Harper and Peter MacKay in 2005, I believe, might have been 2004, might have been 2003. I'm not great with dates, but it was right around there. Right when Paul Martin replaced Jean Chrétien as prime minister. And I think it was the colossus that was known as Paul Martin that kind of got some old foes to reevaluate their position. And, like you said, it was the shock of the 2015 loss that I think led the Wild Rose and Progressive Conservative Party to merge.
And to reconcile largely.
Yeah, and to reconcile, yeah. What I will find interesting, and from my perspective, this is not really the relaunch of the Progressive Conservative Party. This is two malcontents, and that's, an unfortunate word perhaps because it implies that they're, kind of vengeful or something, which I don't think they are. I don't really see this as a real viable launch of a party, just because there's no infrastructure behind it that I can see.
Yeah, they're for them to get feet and move forward, they'd have to have official party status, which they don't have enough MLAs to do.
Is that 4?
I believe it's 4 in Alberta. Yeah.
Okay.
And until they have official party status, they don't get actual caucus funding from the Legislative Assembly office. So it really makes it very difficult for them to operate. They'd be operating at a very minimal staff level. And each member of the Legislative Assembly gets, I believe the number is around $100,000 a year to operate itself. And that has to be split with both the constituency and Edmonton offices. So it's very, very limited into what they'd be able to do. And yes, they can put that 200,000 together between the two of them and kind of work something out, but it would still be split with their two constituency offices. So whatever staff they manage to pull together and organize under the PC party in Edmonton, where the legislature is, it would be very bare bones, and those staffers, having been a staffer myself, will be working very hard. I think it's also important to note, there might not be a better word other than malcontent, but I want to give a shout out to Scott St. Clair and Peter Guthrie. These are two members that I've worked with personally, and I have the utmost respect for both of them. I have worked directly with Minister Guthrie, I guess the Honorable Pete Guthrie, a couple of times, and his character and his dedication and his integrity is absolutely without question. It's on point, and I absolutely respect both of them for that. And they stood on their principles, and they stood by their constituents, and they ended up getting kicked out because of that. And I'm sure that there are other reasons, and it's part of being a part of a party team. And if you no longer feel like you can support that and you end up speaking out in a certain way, the party ends up removing you from its apparatus.
Yeah, that happens with any party.
Yeah, I mean, it happened under Jason Kenney.
Yeah.
It's not uncommon at all.
And as an individual member to speak publicly against your party, and you can vouch for this, I'm sure, I bet they were doing that behind the scenes, and they were availing themselves of every possible avenue to try to move things in the direction that they wanted to within the UCP.
Oh,
and
absolutely.
Only at the very last point, when they realized that there wasn't an option, did they exhaust this final decision, which they subsequently made, to go on their own.
And to go public. Yeah, I mean, make no mistake, the caucus did, have a vote to remove them in particular, but they would have gone, in caucus meetings, and they would have been fighting for their point of view and lost time and time again. And when that didn't work, they went public and tried to create public opinion around their cause. And when that became very problematic for the party, they ended up getting removed. So, that's kind of how that happens. And it's unfortunate, but as I say, I have the utmost respect for both of them. They have integrity, and they're sticking to their principles, whether you agree with them or not. I completely respect them for it, and I think they deserve that respect. And so it'll be interesting to see if they're able to bring this PC party back, and whether it'll be successful.
Yeah, and if they do, what's the electoral calculus going to look like? Do you have a schism between what few urban, well, I guess there's not few, there's a significant amount of Conservatives in Calgary and Edmonton, with the rural caucus? Do you have kind of the reborn feuds between the Wild Rose and the old PC party? One thing that I think is important to note is that although the UCP does have a majority government, it's not a particularly robust majority government.
It's not the strong majority that Jason Kenney won with 63 seats out of 87, and even Ed Stelmach long before him. So they do have to be careful here. It is a tight margin the UCP is operating under, and for any kind of conservative emergence to come back. And I think it was interesting that you bring back the Wild Rose and the PC divide, because when the Wild Rose started to emerge and when Prentice ended up losing in 2015, a lot of those candidates in 2019, or the MLAs that served under the PCs up to 2015, in 2019 they ended up running again, but a lot of them ended up running as Alberta Party MLAs, and they never won again. And the only PC MLA to win re-election that I'm aware of is Minister McIver, and the rest of them they have not had any luck doing that. I think Redford tainted their names so badly that they were attached to that government that they have not been able to get anything back. And when the UCP formed in 2019, they've just kind of stayed away. And in 2023, I think the NDP was so successful in creating its strong opposition, because the Alberta Party collapsed. Their leadership structure it hasn't been the same, and they haven't been able to get themselves organized. So anybody that was in opposition to the far right section of the UCP and how much influence they had or have under Danielle Smith, they just said, you know what, we're just going to either not vote or vote NDP. And I think that really bolstered the NDP's numbers. And if the PCs come back, it'll be very interesting to see the opinion polls and whether or not the PCs take that bite out of the NDP and how much of it comes out of the UCP. Because I think a lot of people look at the UCP and Danielle Smith and think that the UCP is this far right center movement, and certainly there is that section of the base in the UCP that is that, but that's not the whole party. There are fiscal conservatives, but red Tories still within the UCP that are trying to keep things a little bit more moderate, and unfortunately they're not able to have much of a voice, and we can discuss this a little bit more. And I think it would be interesting to discuss where Take Back Alberta comes from within the UCP movement. But what's your take on some of that, John?
Yeah, well, I think those are excellent points, and we're really lucky to have you and your insights here. Yeah, the lot to unpack there. I definitely think that the UCP is vulnerable to a center right challenger. I would regard the UCP under Danielle Smith as a right-wing party. Historically, the Progressive Conservatives were a centrist party that occasionally leaned right, particularly under the premiership of Ralph Klein. Although it is important to note that in the '93 election, Ralph Klein was running on the platform of I think it was terrible cuts, and his opponent, Lawrence Decore, who's since passed away as a Liberal, was talking about brutal cuts. So it was, you probably would have gotten one or the other regardless of who you voted for. A lot of the margins, though, for the PC electorally by district, especially in Calgary, are pretty narrow. They won some of those seats in Calgary in the last election by only a few hundred votes. And if you take a half dozen of those Calgary seats and maybe another half dozen or so in kind of the extra urban seats in St. Albert and Airdrie and places like that didn't have particularly robust majorities either, and you have a competing party on the center right, that could make the difference between a majority and minority government, or perhaps even lose some government altogether.
Absolutely. It would be interesting to see if St. Albert would be more amenable to a return of a PC rather than an NDP, and what the public perception of whether a PC party could really take over from a UCP. A lot of the times now you've got strategic voting and social media influencers say, okay, well, this party doesn't really have much of a chance, so we encourage you to vote for this one. If you're in opposition to Party A, we encourage you to vote for Party B because Party C doesn't really have much of a chance. And so it'll be interesting to see if they're able to overcome that. And that's been, I think, one of the major headaches to even the Alberta Party is they weren't seen as being able to form enough of an opposition or give themselves enough credibility to be able to take over from either the NDP or the UCP. And so it's become this divide between two parties right now in the legislature. You've got the NDP and the UCP squaring off, and it's become very, very polarized. And I think that's very unfortunate because both of those parties don't represent that extreme polarization. There are members of both of those parties that aren't that extreme, but they themselves have pitted themselves into this polarized opposites. We hate your guts, and some of the things that both parties have said to each other in the legislature that you don't actually get to hear on speaker is reprehensible.
There's really a lot of animus that goes both ways. Absolutely.
They do not like each other.
No.
And for a staffer in the legislature, it was always interesting because you tried to build relationships with the other members in the House and the opposition, and there are friendships between members of the UCP and the NDP, but publicly you don't ever see any of that. And, to watch these members publicly interact with each other, it's really not the same as it is behind closed doors sometimes. And that's really unfortunate.
Well, and it's one thing that I always tell people is what you see in question period is not what happens in government.
Mm-hmm.
Question period is, to a large extent, political theater.
Absolutely.
And what happens in government, if you turn on CPAC or watch the legislature, most of the time makes for very bad TV, which is reasonable people having reasonable conversations.
Yeah.
And no one wants to watch that because it's not exciting.
Yeah.
Although what I think we've seen certainly since, Jason Kenney was part of it, and I think it's really amplified under Danielle Smith, and you alluded to it and you spoke about it a moment ago, is the sense of not His Majesty's loyal opposition, but a sworn enemy. And that's expressed in the social media posts that I'm seeing for both of the parties, the public statements. And I think it's a very toxic dynamic when you look across the floor and you're not seeing someone who is elected to hold you accountable, but you're seeing as an impediment to the success and future of Alberta. And I think a lot of them, unfortunately, have fallen into this trap that, any number of places are pushing us towards, is to view an opposition member as an enemy.
Yeah, and I feel like the discussion of the proper role of an opposition could be an entirely separate episode unto itself.
Yeah, that's very nuanced. Yeah,
what their actual
discussion.
role is and what they end up being, and how they actually hurt themselves, I think, in being the opposition that they are rather than the opposition they should be. I just want to quickly steer. We're trying to keep these episodes down a little bit. We're at about a half an hour now, so that was some of the feedback we got from our listeners, which we appreciate.
Yes.
And so we hear a lot of talk in Alberta right now about separation. The Republican Party of Alberta, has ran its first election campaign in some by-elections. And so there is that separatist sentiment. Where did it come from? And John, I think you could probably explain this a little bit. The separatist sentiment in Alberta, I think, really took hold under Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau and the National Energy Program. And that's a little bit more of a technical piece that I think I'll leave to you to explain what the National Energy Program was.
So the National Energy Program was an initiative under former Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau, father of Justin Trudeau, to Canadianize the oil industry in Canada. So it essentially made it easier for Canadian companies to operate and do business in Canada, and harder for American and international ones. Also, a big part of that was the government of Canada getting involved directly in the oil industry through Petro-Canada, which was privatized in the Mulroney government in 86 or 87, I believe. So essentially it was Canada recognizing, and by Canada I mean the federal government, recognizing that there is a large chunk of oil in one of the provinces and they wanted a bigger piece of it. Unfortunately, that correlated to a worldwide drop in oil prices in the early 1980s, to which the NEP, National Energy Program, was disproportionately blamed. Pierre Elliott Trudeau had nothing to do with supply of oil in Arabia. You can't blame him for that. You can blame him if you want for the idea of the national energy policy, but you can't blame him for falling prices, although conservative-minded and conservative politicians and conservative-minded individuals definitely looked at correlation equals causation. I remember growing up in Calgary, the NEP was, if you really wanted to have a swear word that was poignant and pungent, you used NEP. There was a building just coming across the 10th Street Bridge, which was started apparently under the NEP, and it was abandoned, and it was just a shell of a building, just a skeleton of a building. And I remember driving to church every Sunday, my dad shaking his bony fist and saying unkind things about Pierre Trudeau. So it was definitely something that was, and I think even to this day, has a visceral reaction in Calgary and parts of Alberta. So that's a little bit of the history. And under 1982, Lougheed, progressive conservative premier, called an election, and one of the players for power was a party called the Western Canada Concept, which was different than an Alberta separatist party, but it was essentially a party that said BC, Alberta, and Saskatchewan should form their own country.
Yeah.
And there was a by-election, I think in 1981, that the Conservatives, progressive Conservatives, are very afraid that the Western Canada Concept was going to win, and they had a very surprising amount of effort to have their candidate elected. I think they had a majority of 40 or something. Like they had 69 seats or something, and the next party had 6. Like it was just you didn't need to win this one, but they really put a lot of effort because Lougheed always saw himself as a Canadian first, and he really objected to a separatist party getting a foothold in the legislature. One of the things that I was really surprised at, though, is there was a poll that came out, and the reason I was surprised is I thought, well, there's always going to be some separatists. There always was. I can remember family dinners where someone was saying, oh, we should separate, and then we kind of said they were silly, and we went along with the conversation. But there was a poll that came out a couple weeks ago that said that 35% of Albertans are in favor of some sort of separation, be that joining the United States, be that becoming an independent state. I was very surprised at that. I would have liked to see the methodology behind the survey. That doesn't square with my perception of the amount of separatist support.
And it certainly doesn't square with the recent by-election that happened in Olds, Disbury, Three Hills.
Yes.
If there was ever going to be a success for separatism, that by-election would have been it for the Republican Party of Alberta.
Well, they pushed hard. They were running hard.
Oh, yeah. They pushed very hard. They had former UCP staffers in there. That campaign, I think, was run as well as it could have been, but people did not take to it, and the UCP cleaned house once again as far as votes are concerned. So whether it's still credible or not, or whether there are still some separatist sentiment backing Danielle Smith under the UCP, I think that'll be an interesting thing to watch. And so I want to kind of move this into, we're going to have a discussion about the Alberta Next Panel, which Premier Smith has launched, and it smells very much like the panel that was launched by Premier Kenney and Conservative governments before him.
With good reason.
With good reason, yeah. I mean, what are they discussing? And a lot of this came about in the Firewall Letter of 2001. So the National Energy Program, we started there because that's where the separatist sentiment kind of started. Justified or not, people saw that the federal government was coming in and trying to control something that provincially is constitutionally they have jurisdiction over on a provincial level, and the federal government doesn't really have a right to come in and tell Alberta how to run its resource management. And so there was that anger there, and that anger turned into, when the prices dropped, as John mentioned, oh, you caused this is, terrible. Do I agree with the federal government coming in and mandating Alberta resources? Absolutely, I don't. But you have to give credit where credit is due and not give, blame where blame isn't due. And as John mentioned, Prime Minister Trudeau did not have anything to do with the oil collapse in the 70s and the 80s. That program had nothing to do with that. Were they right in trying to control the resources? No, I don't think they were.
It did definitely scare away investment.
Oh, absolutely. Whenever there's uncertainty and what level of control and which level of government is going to control what on development and investment, it always frightens investors like, well, we don't really know what's happening here, so we're going to back off.
Yeah.
And we're seeing that today under Trump. And so in 2001, separatism, had been bubbling and bubbling in Alberta. And when John Chrétien had his very long run of Liberal government, uh, in 2001, some people took to paper, and it'll be interesting for some of our listeners to know that former Prime Minister Harper was one of the signatories on this firewall letter. And essentially, what the letter was is they wanted to look at ways that Alberta could not necessarily separate from Canada, but could take more control over items within the Constitution that it has the ability to do, but for various reasons has allowed Ottawa to do. And these things would be things like provincial policing. We, of course, contract the RCMP to a large extent here in the province of Alberta for rural municipalities. Things like tax collection. The province does have a right to collect its own taxes, but because Canadians have to and Albertans have to file a tax return with the Canadian government anyway, it's been seen as not only easier for Albertans but also cost effective in the collection of taxes. But there's the argument, well, the government is not giving us a fair shake of transfers or whatever else, but that really is disconnected between the Alberta's ability to collect Alberta taxes and what the federal government does with transfers. And we're going to get into that a little bit more. We're going to break this down into different episodes and what the Firewall Letter discussed and what the Alberta Next Panel is still discussing today, so that we can dig into these topics a little bit more. But it also discussed the creation of Alberta pension plan versus the Canadian pension plan, and that'll be a topic for another episode. And so we're sitting here, we're having this panel again, and I almost feel like sometimes politicians now in democracy, they create these panels not only, I think, in the hope that public sentiment will change and that opinions will change, and now they'll have the backing of the public to go forward with some of these policies that they really like and they can't let go, like an Alberta pension plan or provincial police service. And I kind of feel like I'm watching The Nightmare Before Christmas, and you know that scene where the mayor is running around looking for Jack Skellington, and he says, "Come on, Jack, I need you. I'm just a politician. I can't make decisions by myself." Um, I feel like that's what's happening. The public has told you their opinion on the last panel, but you're continuing to consult and consult and consult because you were not elected to be the premier during the time of the last panel, so you want to direct it a different way. And yes, the panel is made up slightly different than it was before, but the topics are the same. And I just can't get over how maybe this is one of the weaknesses that democracy has, is politicians have become less, they develop less of a backbone, and they have to go out and they have to consult, and that takes time and it takes money and it takes so much discussion that we've already had. Like, I feel like we're almost beating our heads against a brick wall with this. But nonetheless, here we are. The Alberta Next Panel has been commissioned, and they're, again, discussing things that were discussed in the Firewall Letter in 2001 and many panels since. CPP, police force, Alberta pension plan,
Tax collection,
and various other topics. And so we are going to discuss some of those in the episodes that follow. It'll be kind of like an Alberta panel series, and we hope you'll join us as we discuss those in the future. Hopefully you found our insights into the history of conservatism in Alberta helpful, and the discussion around separation and why we're kind of where we're at now. And yeah, I look forward to you joining us for future episodes.
As do I. And we're really going to dig into some of these topics that were discussed in the Firewall Letter and really form the basis of what Alberta is trying to get consultation around their various stakeholders, to give them some thoughts around what Albertans think about some very important and salient issues. Why they're doing this is very much open for discussion.
Yeah, but a lot of the mechanics around what they're trying to do, what they can actually do, and what they can't do, and perhaps some of the misconceptions around what those things are and what's happening with those. I think some of these topics have merit and have evolved, and some of them have not. And so, yeah, I very much look forward to discussing it with you. We look forward for you joining us on the next episode of Real Sensical Politics. And goodbye for now. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for joining us.